start, we will be going over the poem Hope is a Thing with Feathers. We will talk about the life of the poet and the context behind the poem's writing. Then we will give a reading of the poem. Afterwards, we will break it down and analyze the language and message of the poem. Then we will compare the poem and the song and the similarities. Afterwards, we will analyze the song and talk about the writer. And finally, we will talk about the social issue that the two connect to.
As we go through the life of Emily Dickinson, we will discuss her background, her personal experiences, her writing career, the critical reception of her work, the social issues of the time period, and any historical developments or changes that affected her work. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born December 10, 1830 in Massachusetts and died May 15, 1886 at the age of 55. Emily Dickinson was an American lyric poet who lived in isolation with a brilliant mind and was widely considered to be one of the two leading poets of the 19th century. Of Emily Dickinson's nearly 1,800 poems, only 10 are known to have been published in her lifetime. She was devoted to private pursuits and sent hundreds of poems to friends and correspondents while keeping most of them to herself. She frequently used verse forms with 3 or 4 stresses per line, similar of hymns and ballads. She freely disregarded grammar and versification conventions, and in her work she proved both bold and original. Her verse is distinguished by its epigrammatic compression, haunting personal voice, enigmatic brilliance, and a lack of high polish. Emily Dickinson was the second of 3 children with a very wealthy family background. During her first 9 years, she lived in a mansion built and owned by her grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, who had helped to found Amherst College, but went bankrupt shortly before she was born. Her father, however, was a prosperous lawyer who served as a treasurer of Amherst and was elected to 1 term in Congress. Her mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, was an introverted wife and a hard-working stay-at-home mother. It is said that both parents were loving but austere. This led to Emily to bond closely with her brother Austin and her sister Lavinia. As a girl, Emily was seen as frail by her parents and others and was often kept home from school. She attended Amherst Academy, where she was recognized by both teachers and students for her prodigious abilities in composition. She also excelled in many other subjects, including Latin and the different sciences. Although Dickinson had begun composing verse by her late teens, few of her original poems are in circulation. Among them are 2 Valentines, which were expressions of affection and esteem she sent to her friends of youth. 2 other poems dating from the first half of the 1850s contrast the world at the time and a more peaceful alternative. Until Dickinson was in her mid-20s, most of her writing took the form of letters, and a surprising number of those that she wrote from age 11 onward have been preserved. Most of these letters were sent to her brother Austin or to friends, especially Abia Rote, Jane Humphrey, and Susan Gilbert, who would later marry Austin. These poems were filled with both humor and somber reflection. Dickinson seemed to have demanded more from her correspondence than she received. Because of this, she interpreted her correspondence' seeming lack of effort in replying as evidence of neglect or even betrayal. The loss of friends, whether through death or cooling interests, became frequent for Dickinson. Much of her writing, both poetic and in letters, seemed based on a feeling of abandonment and a matching effort to deny, overcome, or reflect a sense of solitude. Emily began restricting her social activity in her early 20s, staying home from communal events and cultivating intense epistolary relationships with far fewer people. When she finally returned home in 1855, she found it profoundly disturbing, with her mother incapacitated by a mysterious illness that began in 1855 and lasted until 1859. Various events outside the home, including a bitter Norcross family lawsuit, the financial collapse of the local railroad that had been promoted by the poet's father, and a powerful religious revival that renewed the pressure to convert, made the years 1857 and 1858 deeply troubling for Dickinson and promoted her further withdrawal. In the summer of 1858, at the height of this period of obscure tension, Dickinson began creating manuscript books. She made clean copies of her poems on fine quality stationery and then sewed small bundles of these sheets together at the fold. Over the next 7 years, she created 40 such booklets and several unsung sheaves, and altogether they contain about 800 poems. It is possible she anticipated posthumous publication and arranged her poems in such a manner. Because she left no instructions regarding her manuscript books, her reason for assembling them remains unknown. In her last 15 years, Dickinson averaged 35 poems a year and conducted her social life mainly through her written messages. Her father's sudden death in 1874 caused a profound and persisting emotional upheaval that eventually led to a greater openness and serenity in her writing. From 1859 to 1862, Dickinson experienced a painful and obscure personal crisis likely due to a toxic relationship. The pleading drafts of her second and third letters addresses an unidentified person she calls Master, and is probably related to her many poems about a loved but distant person, usually male. Whoever the person was, Master's failure to return Dickinson's affection contributed to a piercing and ultimate sense of distress. In a letter, Dickinson described her lonely suffering as, quote, a terror, since September that I could tell to none. Instead of succumbing to anguish, however, she came to view it as a sign of a special vocation, and it became the basis of an unprecedented creativity. A poem that seems to register this life-restoring act of resistance begins, "The zeros taught us phosphorus," meaning that it is in absolute cold and nothingness that true brilliance originates. Hope is the thing with feathers theme focuses on her struggle and her persistence to endure. After Dickinson's aging mother was incapacitated by a stroke and a broken hip, caring for her at home made large demands on the poet's time and patience. After her mother died in 1882, Dickinson summed up the relationship in a confidential letter to her Norcross cousins. "We were never intimate, mother and children, while she was our mother. But, when she became our child, the affection came." The deaths of Dickinson's friends in her last years left her feeling extremely lonely. However, the single most shattering death, occurring in 1883, was that of her 8-year-old nephew next door, the gifted and charming Gilbert Dickinson. After his death, she stopped seeing almost everyone, including her sister-in-law. Emily later died in 1886 when she was 55 years old. Despite her modernism, Dickinson's verse drew very little interest from the first generation of high modernists. Hart Crane and Alan Tate were among the first leading writers to register her greatness, followed in the 1950s by Elizabeth Bishop and others. From the beginning, however, Dickinson had strongly appealed to many ordinary or unschooled readers. Her unmistakable voice establishes an immediate connection. At the same time, her great range of feelings and expressiveness testifies to an intrinsic poetic genius. Widely translated into Japanese, Italian, French, German, and many other languages, Dickinson has begun to strike readers as the one American lyric poet who belongs in the pantheon with Sappho, Catullus, Sadi, the Shakespeare the Sonnets, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Arthur Rimbaud. The social issue of Emily Dickinson's time period was oppression. During the American Civil War, many people were segregated and discriminated based off of gender, race, and religion. In Dickinson's time, women had a role of housekeeping and had very few rights, including an inability to vote, and few had jobs. Most of their jobs included being a domestic servant, a farmhand, a tailor, or a washerwoman. In the war itself, black people were assigned to different regiments, usually commanded by a white officer. Black soldiers also received less pay than white soldiers and had poorer food and equipment despite having been promised equal treatment. Dickinson used her pen and her strong first-person perspective to meditate on the themes of spirituality, nature, death, gender, social conventions, salvation, the soul, and immortality. Through poetry, she grappled with the trappings of society while also longing to surpass them. Though Dickinson wrote little about the American Civil War, which was being fought at the time, her awareness of its tragedies seems to have empowered her poetic drive. In the hundreds of poems Dickinson composed during the war, a common theme is seen from the expression of immediate pain or exultation to the celebration of achievement and self-command. Emily explored the tragic ironies of human desire, such as fulfillment denied and the terrors of internal dissolution. She also voiced a profound sense of female subjectivity, expressing what it means to be subordinate, secondary, or not in control. Yet, as the war proceeded, she also wrote with growing frequency about self-reliance, personal triumph, and hard-won liberty.
is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. The first line of the poem is a metaphor. The metaphor expands on the connection between the feeling of hope and a bird. This connection amplifies the feeling of hope, just as a bird can fly into places, just as hope reaches everywhere. The second line is a paradox. The paradox displays how the bird, that is a symbol for hope, can make someone feel hopeful without the need for words or tunes. The sixth line is a personification. This personification shows how even a storm that ruins ships must be sore to ruin the feeling of hope, and that the storm represents a person that destroys this feeling. The 12th line is a symbol. The symbol of a crumb represents the little hope that we give to make the feelings fly to others. The rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, E, F, E, F, and G, H, H, H. Storm and warm convey how, even though a storm, hope will make people better. Herd and bird shows the connection because the bird represents hope, and so herd and hope is well connected throughout the poem. The overall message of Hope is the Thing with Feathers is that hope can make the worst parts of the world feel a little bit better. The idea of hope can show up in places like battlefields and hospitals. Places of both life and death carries the weight of why hope is so important. I've heard it in the chilliest lands and on the strangest seas. Shows the feeling is the same but found in completely different places. And sweetest in the gale is heard shows how even through harsh environments, hope can still reach people and help them. Hope is important to the world because of how it makes an individual feel that the world is still good and just. That perches in the soul.